train on the 4th of July in Pullman.
Well, what makes Pullman special is the role it's played in our history. This place has been a milestone in our journey toward a more perfect union.
Our story begins in Chicago in November 1921. In a neighborhood just a short distance from the downtown, the streets surrounding a storied mansion on Prairie Avenue were overflowing with vehicles and curious onlookers, causing a traffic jam for blocks around. The event drawing all the attention was the auction of the contents of the famous Pullman Mansion.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, our next item, beautiful, two royal separate vases.
A dense throng of people packed into the first floor of the mansion. They pushed their way through a maze of richly decorated rooms, running their fingers along antique tapestries, inspecting custom-made furnishings, and gazing at priceless works of art.
So, $390, thank you.
The sale would include fine china, crystal, porcelains, draperies, carpets, and furniture. But it was more than just the contents. The custom-made wood paneling, doors, cornices, and columns, built-in bookcases, sideboards, and cabinets would all be pried from the ceilings, walls, and floors. And what wasn't given away to friends and family would be sold to the highest bidder.
Sold $550, we thank you.
It was a swift fall for the palatial mansion, known as the social center of Chicago for nearly 50 years. The home had been built for George Mortimer Pullman, the railroad industrialist who came from relative obscurity to become one of the most famous and powerful men in the country, if not the world. Pullman revolutionized rail travel across the globe with his luxurious passenger cars, and unwittingly, with the development of the model town to house his workers, ushered in the modern labor movement. For 3 days in November of 1921, Pullman's home, his seat of power, was methodically dismantled, piece by piece. Many wondered how a landmark like this could be so easily destroyed, and if this would be the beginning of the end of the Pullman Empire. One thing that was evident to everyone who witnessed the auction and eventual demolition of the structure was that this was the end of an era.
I saw the Indiana Jones movie today, and
in the early 1980s, a young Chicago architect was about to make a once-in-a-lifetime discovery. He, along with colleagues, were hired by a developer to inspect the old Chicago Historical Society building on the corner of Dearborn and Ontario, with plans to develop a high-rise nearby.
The building was, it wasn't heated, it was uncomfortable in there, and the stair to the basement was underneath the grand staircase that went to the second floor of the Historical Society building. And so we went down there. The lighting was minimal, so it was relatively dark. I happened to notice that there was a lot of late 19th century woodwork on the floor of the basement, which was a little odd.
What he found was over 100 highly carved pieces of lumber, door frames, pediment headers, inlaid wood panels, staircase railings, large columns, and crown moldings, all highly decorated in various rare woods. Some items were painted white and gold, most others were covered with a dark stain and varnish. All of it was piled high, gathering dust and debris on the basement floor of the old building. He had discovered the long-lost architectural wood fragments that were pried away from the Pullman Mansion on Prairie Avenue in November of 1921, 63 years before.
And as we explored it and turned it over, and with a little flashlight, trying to read what was there. To our surprise, each of the pieces were identified Pullman on the back of it, and with an identification number which corresponded to the architectural plans as to its specific location in a particular room.
In 1870, businessman George Pullman purchased a vacant lot at the northeast corner of Prairie Avenue and 18th Street. When most lots in the area were going for $300 to $400, George Pullman paid $500 per foot, the highest paid in Chicago at the time. His purchase there signaled that Prairie Avenue was becoming the city's new elite enclave.
Prairie Avenue had developed as the premier residential street in the last 3 decades of the 19th century. And what really established it was when Pullman, Marshall Field, and Philip Armour, Chicago's 3 wealthiest citizens, when they decided to settle here and build, that really put Prairie Avenue on the map and made it one of the most prominent residential streets in the country.
In the early 1870s, he hired architect Henry S. Jaffray and builder John M. Dunphy to start constructing a mansion in the French Second Empire style.
Dear Sir, I had counted on your return before this, or I would have written concerning progress of the work sooner. Everything is finished with the exception of pantry work and a little painting. In the new part of the house, and in the old part, a few days will see everything complete. Very truly yours, Henry S. Jaffray.
The exterior of the Pullman house would have been very prominent on Prairie Avenue. It was one of the 2 largest houses on the street, and the materials also made it stand out. The beautiful sandstone, the very tall mansard roof, the prominent corner lot. These are all things that people would have noticed as they were coming down the street. So it was clearly a house that was built to impress as you approached.
It was said to be the most lavish and beautiful house constructed in the entire city, and featured a 200-seat theater, billiard room, bowling alley, and pipe organ. It was completed in the mid-1870s. A large addition by Solon S. Beeman in 1892 added more space, including a huge palm room with a 40-foot leaded glass dome and outdoor terraces set with marble mosaics. It should have come as no surprise to Chicagoans that George Pullman would create a luxurious home. He would become known for creating luxurious sleeping railroad cars, as well as an entire town for his workers, all focusing on innovation, amenities, and luxury. In order to ensure that the interior mirrored the taste and elegance of the exterior, the Pullmans would go on to work with only the best interior decorators. Most notably, they commissioned the firms of Pottier Stymus and Herter Brothers, 2 of the leading cabinet makers and decorating establishments at the time, to decorate and furnish the rooms in their new home. For the Pullman Mansion, Pottier and Stymus designed and produced interior decoration and furniture in a variety of styles, ranging from Egyptian Revival, Louis XVI Revival, and Neo-Grec, to modern Goth and Anglo-Japanese. During the late 19th century, this type of furniture, interior woodwork, and decoration became popular with the elite throughout the United States. Companies such as Pottier and Stymus flourished during this period, receiving commissions from wealthy individuals for custom-made furnishings. Pottier and Stymus depended on the skills of highly trained immigrant craftsmen from modern-day France and Germany. Pottier and Stymus, in particular, used a detailed system of documentations for its products. From the beginning of the manufacturing process, each piece of furniture was assigned a multi-digit number, and pieces which belonged together were given sequential numbers. The Pullman family refurbished and enlarged the original home over the years, and ultimately used various prominent decorating firms, including Herter Brothers and A.H. Davenport Company, to fill it in a number of historical styles, such as Italian Renaissance, Louis XV, and Empire, as well as in the exotic Moorish style. There is no surviving overall layout of the structure, but before the home's demolition, the family had most of the principal rooms photographed, which allows us to recreate the floor plan and virtually tour the interiors. The entrance hall, which was decorated in a blend of Near and Far Eastern styles, had ebonized woodwork. The lower part of the walls featured wainscoting divided into small square panels with carved decorations based on Chinese furniture. By contrast, the painted patterns on the upper wall area consisted of Egyptian motifs. When entering the home from a carriage on the 18th Street side of the property, under the porte cochere, guests were led down a neo-Grec-styled hall to the grand staircase. On either side of the hall were square columns and cast iron railings that contained exotic plants and small fountains that ran continuously.
Because a lot of people did arrive by carriage, especially for larger entertainments. This would have been how many people would have come into the house.
Ascending from this hall was an elaborate staircase featuring a large newel post decorated with gilt bronze classical masks and surmounted by an ornate glass light fixture. The grand staircase led to a second-floor hallway where the family's bedrooms were located. Directly south of the entrance hall is the earliest known Egyptian revival interior, documented to Pottier Stymus. The room was separated from the hall by an impressive screen of columns that supported brackets under a cornice surmounted in the center by a crest composed of lotus flower, sphinxes, and a winged sun disk. Similar details were incorporated into the window cornices, the overmantel, and the frame of the door in the northeast wall.
The furniture in the Egyptian room, as well as the trim, was all ebonized. And to the layman, this would basically look like furniture that is painted black, but it's actually a much more complicated finish. It's a very high gloss black surface. It increases that kind of exotic feel to it because you don't see the wood grain, you really see that. And then all of the decoration that is incised or cut into it is highlighted with gold leaf and that sort of thing. So there's this very strong contrast between the black and the decoration.
The massive mantelpiece featured projecting pedestal sections decorated with carved Egyptian heads. The walls used painted decorations of Egyptian designs that exactly mirrored the patterns on the walls of the entrance hall.
Houses of this period did tend to be very full of things. This was another way of kind of showing your wealth as well as your taste. And so pretty much every surface would be filled, whether it's you know, vases or lamps or statuary, whatever it is. It's all just kind of crammed together. So to modern tastes, it looks very, very cluttered. To the Victorians, that was exactly the effect they were going for.
Researchers have been able to locate one major piece from the Egyptian room, the long bookcase incorporating a desk and cabinets. The surviving piece was purchased by a collector in New Orleans and clearly indicates that the furniture as well as the woodwork in the Egyptian room was ebonized. The bookcase is comprised of a fall front secretary, glazed bookcases, and end cabinets with panel doors. A variety of motifs derived from ancient Egypt ornament the piece, including lotus and papyrus flowers carved in the doors of the cabinets. The dark ebonized finish is offset by colorful bands and by gilt bronze mounts in the form of Egyptian heads. Mahogany moldings, framing cabinet doors, and drawer fronts provide further contrast with the ebonizing. In 1888, the Chicago Tribune said of the Pullman drawing room, "In point of location, size, and architecture, it surpasses any room of its kind in Chicago, whether public or private." The drawing room was the mansion's most opulent and formal interior. It featured 2 projecting bay windows on the north side and a pair of columns supporting an arch that separated the area at the east end from the main part of the space on the west end.
This was a very light space. All the trim was done in white enamel and gold leaf. The walls were done in kind of pastels, so it had a very feminine feel to it. So that's why it was typically called her room, because this is where she would entertain all her lady friends. But it was an absolutely huge space. I mean, you would look at it and it almost felt like more than one room, because it had a couple of very deep kind of bay areas, and so there were multiple areas for seating and that sort of thing. This would have been the room you would have walked into, and it would have almost felt more like a hotel lobby because it was just so large in scale.
The white enameled and gilt woodwork consisted of wainscoting, columns, pilasters, pedestals, door and window frames, a mantelpiece, and mirror frames, all in the Louis XVI style.
This would function well for things like weddings or more formal events like that. It was just so large that when you had these events with hundreds of people, this is the one easy space in the house where you could have actually fit them all at one time, and then people would break up and go into other spaces. But this would have been a main focal place for the largest events.
The walls and ceilings were decorated with canvas panels with designs in the same woodwork. Originally, the seating furniture in the drawing room consisted almost entirely of fully upholstered pieces with elaborate trimmings.
So in this floor plan, we can see the arrangement of the furniture. As I say, it was such a large space, it really felt like multiple spaces kind of put together. So they worked with a very prominent company, A.H. Davenport out of Boston, to actually come up with a furnishing plan for just this space. You can see, a grand piano, sofas, chairs, things all over the space, really kind of defining within the larger room smaller spaces where people could have kind of grouped and gathered.
It was at the end of the 19th century that saw the advent of large purpose-built organs in the private homes of those wealthy enough to afford such things. They were usually not played by the owners themselves, but by professional organists whose services they would hire for private concerts and the like. The Pullmans were no different. When George and Harriet Pullman built their mansion in the late 1800s, they made sure that their love of music was an integral part of the new home.
And this was placed in kind of a central area between the dining room and the drawing room, so that when it was played, you would hear the music throughout all the first floor rooms.
The The Red Room was named for the crimson-colored silk damask wall coverings of this sitting room.
The Red Room would have had a little less formal feel to it. This was very common to have your formal parlor and more of your family or less formal parlor. And it's represented here because what you see on the walls are actually portraits of the Pullman family members as opposed to famous works of art, which is what you see in the large, more formal drawing room.
The trims in this room were painted white and decorated in the Louis XV style.
It was not as large as the drawing room, so again, it was mostly Mrs. Pullman's use, but if she had a slightly smaller gathering, maybe 50 or 70 people instead of 200, this would have felt more appropriate for that sort of thing.
The dining room of the Pullman Mansion was among Pottier Stymus's earliest interiors in the modern Gothic style, a style derived from furniture in medieval times. Forms were solid. They had detailed ornamentations, with an emphasis placed on structure. The woodwork on the lower part of the walls included small square panels painted with stylized leaves. The massive mantelpiece and sizable overmantel mirror were flanked on each side by cupboards with open shelves echoing sections of a large sideboard that stood on the opposite side of the room. Under the paneled and painted ceiling was a frieze with large distinctive brackets that were reminiscent of hammer beams and braces found in the timber ceilings of English medieval great halls. The furniture in this room included an extension table, side and armchairs, 2 buffets, and 2 wall-mounted cabinets. The dining room sideboard is one of the largest and most important artifacts saved from the Pullman Mansion. The historic Pullman Foundation purchased it at auction in the mid-1970s for $2,000, and it's still on exhibit at the Pullman National Monument's Exhibit Hall. The walnut sideboard is architectural in composition, with heavy Gothic-style columns supporting cupboard sections, as well as the overarching parapet that surmounts the piece. The cupboard doors are decorated with flowers and leaves that are either incised or carved in low relief. The medieval quality of the piece is enhanced by the large brass strap hinges, based on the iron hinges found on furniture made in the Middle Ages. In the small square panels of the drawer fronts are gilt-painted leaves, a treatment that echoed the decoration in the paneled walls of the dining room. In the 1890s, Pullman hired architect Solon S. Beeman to design a large addition, which was built onto the northeast corner of the house. The extension included a new library, billiard room, and palm room. The design firm of Herter Brothers was responsible for the decorations and furniture. The library, which was separated from the dining room by this short passageway, was relatively small compared to the other areas of the mansion.
This was, again, a very dark space, dark wood. This is where he would entertain his male friends, conduct business, smoke cigars, do that sort of thing. So it was a very masculine, dark space.
The woodwork in this room, rounded niches, as well as the gilt plaster relief decoration, are in the Renaissance style. While it's called a library, there are not many books here. It would have likely been used as an area to get to the billiard and palm rooms. While the women would often gather in the drawing room, gentlemen visitors would often gather in the billiard room for entertainment after dinner. The room featured a large billiard table and gave the Pullmans a room to display rare books and artwork. Rooms like the billiard room reflected the Gilded Age interest in the sport. Billiards became popular with men of the period, and most estates included similar game rooms. The palm room was designed as an elegant setting to grow and exhibit fragrant flowers, exotic palms, and delicate orchids in abundance all year long. The furnishings here are in the Moorish style and was complemented by overstuffed sofas, a folding screen, oriental rugs, and of course, palm trees. All created an exotic environment suggesting influence from the Middle East. George Pullman, his wife Harriet, and their 4 children resided in the home and kept a full social calendar while in residence. The Pullman Mansion was known as the social center in Chicago, as the family hosted many large formal events, concerts, and meetings there over the years. A mansion like this wouldn't have been able to function without an army of servants who cared for the family and maintained the home. Maggie Barron Davis was one such individual.
She was a maid. I believe she was also a companion to one of the Pullman daughters, and then as she stayed with the mansion, she kind of took over the management of the household.
A maid would have done just about everything to keep the householder's house in order, from emptying chamber pots to making beds, doing linens, all those things.
Servants in the Pullman Mansion would have been expected to work long hours and to complete general household tasks, and sometimes they were expected to shoulder more unusual responsibilities.
There was a big society party, and at that time everyone wore furs, so there was a fur room where everyone's furs were put. My great-grandmother, Maggie Davis, was given a gun to walk around the house, and she went into the fur room to check the fur room, and there was a man climbing in the window trying to steal all the furs. So apparently she took the gun and shot him straight out the window.
Maggie was a young widow and often arrived to work at the mansion with her 2 young daughters, May and Helen, in tow. In the 1970s, Maggie's daughter, May, recorded an oral history where she revealed information on her time at the mansion.
Now I'm going to tell you a story, but it's a long one. Think over all the things that have gone by through all the years, and I should try to just say it to this box, which I don't enjoy very much, but I guess I'll get used to it. So we grew up anyhow. We had a lot of experience. In the meantime, some summers we would close up our apartment and go down and take care of the Pullman Mansion. And my mother would oversee all the cleaners and all the men that were coming in there. Every year they would do over the whole house. And she'd taken charge of it, see that everything was taken care of, and we'd live there.
Mrs. Pullman traveled constantly, but always was in communication with her staff at the mansion to go over household items.
My dear Maggie, we shall soon now be going home, or at least the servants and horses will go, either on Monday or Tuesday, a little in advance of us. I am taking a new girl home with me to fill Jess's place, and am thinking over the matter of rooms. I have decided that as I have a dressmaker engaged for October, that Emma will have the corner room so that the work can be kept there in one place. This woman I have hired is a married woman and has been, I believe, a working housekeeper. She will have the room Emma has always occupied, and Lizzie can fix up the room John has had. But we'll have our little Lizzie, whom we find a very nice child, sleep in this room, since it is large enough to put a cot there for her. You can place it somewhere and place a screen in her corner so that Lizzie will have, for all intents and purposes, the room to herself. This is the best I can do with this limited number of sleeping rooms we have, and I hope you can arrange everything satisfactorily and pleasantly. With kind remembrance to you all, I am most sincerely Mrs. George M. Pullman.
George Pullman became sick in 1897 and died at the family home. So he died, and obviously this created, amongst the company, amongst his large cadre of friends, very sad. It was somewhat unexpected. He had been sick for a while, but I think he thought he had a long time left, and so that really obviously cast a pall upon the house.
The Pullman sons both died at early ages by 1905, and his daughters had married and moved into their own homes. Harriet Sanger Pullman continued to live and entertain in the Prairie Avenue mansion. But the area around the home was about to take a turn for the worse, one that would make it almost unrecognizable from its prime in the 1870s and 1880s. By 1898, over 30 of the Prairie Avenue residents housed elderly people. Guidebooks had been noting that since the early 1890s, many of the houses on the Avenue of Avenues were comparatively old, and some were even weather-worn.
What made Prairie Avenue popular in its heyday was its close proximity to downtown, and that was ultimately what led to its decline, because as downtown expanded, it pushed light industry farther and farther out of the loop. One of the directions it came was to the south, and so this very exclusive residential enclave eventually became surrounded by factories, which created noise and dirt and traffic, and so a lot of the families started to move away.
By 1900, the automobile permitted the new generation to live far from the railroad soot. The new mobility came at the same time that Chicago's society stabilized around Lakeshore Drive on Chicago's north side. In the early 1900s, warehouses appeared on the near south side, near Prairie Avenue. Indiana Avenue was particularly vulnerable, and in 1905, large factories started to appear in the area. Between 1908 and 1910, owners unloaded their houses on automobile manufacturers who demolished them wholesale to build showrooms. The transformation of Automobile Row was complete in less than 2 years. In 1912, a police raid found sporting houses as far east as Indiana Avenue, right at the back door of Prairie Avenue homes. In 1917, a renowned madam, Vic Shaw, openly moved her operations into a house at 2904 Prairie Avenue. It was during this time that the printing industry took hold a couple blocks from the Pullman Mansion. The new character of the area was fixed by 1917, when R.R. Donnelly, the nation's largest printer, began its huge lakeside press building on Calumet Avenue. Publishers and businesses associated with printing took over several of the mansions along Prairie Avenue. Many of the homes were subdivided for borders. Real estate experts claimed that the land was worth more without the houses.
Eventually, it was the publishing and printing industry that largely kind of took over the entire neighborhood, and that was well underway by the time Mrs. Pullman died.
Harriet Sanger Pullman died on March 29, 1921. Her funeral was the last large-scale event to be held inside the Pullman Mansion. Newspaper photographs show crowds of curious onlookers outside the home at the time.
So there was an understanding within the family that no one was going to continue to live in the house. They did not want to see it sold because so many of the other houses were turned into business use or boarding houses. So they made the decision to basically have a huge auction, sell off the contents of the house.
On November 28th, 29th, and 30th in 1921, the Pullman daughters had the auction house of Williams, Barker, and Severn Company to sell every single item left in the house, including the original architectural elements.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, our next item beautiful two royal Sevres vases. These are beautiful porcelain. Take a look.
And it was really an extraordinary moment because, you know, the vast majority of Chicagoans had never been allowed to set foot inside that house. And all of a sudden, in preparation for the auction, the doors were thrown open and anybody could walk in. And it would have been their one and only chance to really get a sense of exactly how the Pullmans had lived. So the auction was basically everything you saw because the intent was to demolish the house afterwards, and so people could buy not only furniture and decorative arts, but you could actually buy the trim from around a doorway. You could buy a built-in bookcase. Ironically, when they had the auction in the house, the newspaper accounts are that many of the pieces were being sold for just pennies on the dollar for what Mrs. Pullman had paid for them initially 40, 50 years earlier. So it didn't necessarily bring them great amounts of money, but it was a way to just kind of find a new home for these things when the house on Prairie Avenue just became obsolete.
One thing not on the list of items to be sold was Mrs. Pullman's dog, Bosco.
Mrs. Pullman had had a long-time lady's maid that she was very close to, and so Bosco was given to the lady's maid who cared for him for the rest of his days.
Within weeks, crews arrived and started to demolish the exterior walls of the home.
Today we think of something like this being demolished and you have a high-rise that goes up. This is being demolished just because of the decline of the neighborhood, and in fact, after it came down, the lot sat vacant for quite a few years. A decade later, when the 33 World's Fair takes place nearby, the lot is turned into a parking lot. Eventually, what was built on the property and the properties that would have been to the north of the Pullman house was a huge one-story brick garage, basically for housing buses. And so that, again, kind of shows what happened to the neighborhood at that time. There was a small plaque on the building that acknowledged it as the site of the Battle of Fort Dearborn, but at that point nothing left where people would have had any indication that the Pullman Mansion would have stood here. That was something that just kind of slid into obscurity, as did Prairie Avenue pretty much as a whole.
After the home was broken apart and sold off, pieces from the Pullman Mansion would appear in random places from time to time. That ultimately led to the discovery by architect Michael Shymanski of the large cache of architectural fragments on the basement floor of the old Chicago Historical Society building.
So it was, I mean, very surprising. It was like, holy cow. And, you know, I mean, it's totally serendipity that you are in a position where you have some knowledge of what you're looking at, and you're able to tie the things together in order to save this stuff. And there are some spectacular pieces in there, and it's an excellent collection of the styles of that period.
In fact, a lot of these pieces were salvaged and purchased, and a number of them have survived and still survive to this day. So it's wonderful that that happened, because you really get an entirely different sense of what these pieces look like and how they were constructed when you can hold them in your hands, as opposed to just seeing them in a black and white photograph.
Today, Prairie Avenue has gone through a renaissance and looks much different than it did in the early 1920s when the Pullman Mansion was demolished. The few original mansions have been restored to their former glory. Most of the manufacturing factories have been replaced by period-appropriate townhouses. And the Glessner House, which was across from the Pullman Mansion, is currently a popular house museum.
So in the early 2000s, as Prairie Avenue started to come back, most of the properties on the street were purchased by developers with the idea of constructing condos and townhouses and that sort of thing.
It's once again a fashionable place for Chicagoans to reside. The site where the Pullman Mansion sat is now occupied by townhouses and a large condominium.
So it's interesting to think how many people now live on the site of what had been a single-family home.
While it's been over a century since the Pullman Mansion sat at 18th Street and Prairie Avenue, the home and its occupants will not soon be forgotten.